So joining us today is Josh Corman. So Josh, do you want to tell the folks who you're with, where you're from?
All your secret stuff.
Yeah.
All my secret stuff. So I'm wearing a couple hats, but I am Josh Corman. I'm the chief strategist for the Cisa COVID task force. So I should probably define what Cisa is. Cisa is the newest federal agency, a little over 2 years old. It's the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, born to really rise to meet the moment on our overdependence on undependable things in critical infrastructure. And as the newest federal agency, we try to be the nation's risk management advisor. But as our new confirmed director, Jen Easterly, likes to say, we don't want to just be the nation's risk advisor. We want to be the risk reducer. So we're trying to identify and buy down risk for our nation's critical infrastructure and attacks against the federal government agencies as well. I am not a traditional govy. I'm here on temporary authorities. Congress passed the CARES Act hiring authority near the beginning of the pandemic. And I was recruited by then Director Krebs to develop a strategy and drive the pandemic response for Cisa, which has been an intense ride with amongst other massively multidisciplinary hires. My private sector life. I'm what you get when you put a philosopher in the hacker community and the cybersecurity community for a couple decades. But I teach CISO programs for the Carnegie Mellon University grad school program. I'm a founder of IamTheCavalry.org, a group of helpful hackers trying to save lives through security research. It's over 1,000 volunteers, never taken a penny. We just try to make the world a safer place. We say it's wherever bits and bytes meet flesh and blood. And in my day jobs, I tend to be a CTO, CISO, CSO type in public and private companies. But we really wanted to make sure that we had a bridge between the private sector targets for both healthcare delivery in hospitals and for what at the time was Operation Warp Speed, or the development and distribution of vaccines, diagnostics, therapeutics to protect the American public and its interests. And I know we're going to get into it, so I should probably also disclose that as part of the CISA 2015 law, different CISA, I served on a congressional task force for healthcare industry cybersecurity, and our report published on Mother's Day weekend 2017 as WannaCry destroyed healthcare delivery in the UK, affecting 40% or so of the National Health Service capacity, and which has really given birth to how I met you two, which is the 405D process. So I was the 405C part of that law, and now you're living the execution with the public-private partnership of 405D under CISA authorities for HHS, HPH, and all the three-letter acronyms. And it's a privilege to meet you and join your awesome podcast, which did not spell it like hippos. So that's good.
So as all of our listeners know, we brought you on to make us look like big fat losers. So slackers that we are know when we have the opportunity to bring in somebody that's got a lot of that under their belt, we should not miss it. So thanks for joining us to celebrate as we do Cybersecurity Awareness Month, if you can call it celebrating. So for everyone here, as we go along, Josh is a catchphrase machine, and we'll throw them out as we hit them. But I know that there are some big points that you want to make sure we hit, particularly related to the new report that came out. You guys did on, I'm finding the title of the report, provide medical care in critical condition. Let's see, analysis and stakeholder decision support to minimize further harm. Is that it?
That's the title.
Parts of it.
It's a mouthful. We have a lot of special phrases
yes.
in this work. Sure, we can touch on that. Maybe I should back up a little bit just because so few are familiar with CISA. So I said a few things that were true, but so CISA is not your regulator. It's not law enforcement. It's really here to identify and buy down risk. to our nation's interests in critical infrastructure, both in cybersecurity and physical security. So through that, there's a bunch of taxpayer-funded services that are free to anyone in one of these 16 critical infrastructure sectors. HPH, the acronym we blew past a minute ago, is healthcare and public health. And across these 16 critical infrastructures sectors, we have statutory authorities to provide assistance left of boom and right of boom. So before harm, ideally, and after harm. And as the newest member of the pantheon of the federal government, we're a complement to other existing agencies that you've been dealing with a lot longer. So different, I liken it to the superheroes like the Avengers movies. Each superhero has different powers, and no matter who you call on first, eventually, ideally, if it's merited, you'll get the entire team of Avengers and complementary skills. But we each express different authorities and different powers at different times. So people don't know what to make of us, but one of our superpowers is, we're not your regulator. We're not your law enforcement. Our focus is to prevent harm or to help you restore services quickly if you do suffer from harm. And we have certain powers from the CISA 2015 law that eventually turned into CISA as an agency. And those are things like certain levels of protection and safe harbor that the act of sharing cyber threat indicators cannot be used against you in regulatory actions and whatnot. So we're essentially a safe clearinghouse that perhaps you have a failure at a hospital or at another part of critical infrastructure. We can safely engage, assist you, but also harvest that cyber threat information and anonymize it and share it to make sure that your right of boom failure becomes a left of boom prevention for your peers or other sectors that may be the next victims of that unscrupulous attacker or attacker.
Yeah, learn from others. Others, whatever, whether it's a mistake, a failure, or just being a victim.
Yeah.
If we can learn from that. But I also want you to, and now I can't recall what it is, the motto of
call to one of us is a call to all of us.
Well,
no. Yeah, the mottos. So part of how CISA introduces itself is defend today, secure today, defend tomorrow.
There we go. That was the one.
And I screw it up all the time too, because there's also the third one, to build back better, right? Sometimes you have an unplanned disaster, but it might create an opportunity to not just go back to less defensible IT choices. So let's get that right. It's defend today, secure tomorrow. So we want to do the best we can on our traditional IT and our legacy choices, which are not always the best for cybersecurity, but we want to make sure that the future is a more defensible and resilient and recoverable future. So we have, to borrow from my cavalry group, when I launched that, I said our dependence on connected technology is growing faster than our ability to secure it in areas affecting public safety, human life, and national security. And I meant every ounce of that on August 1st, 8 years ago. So now at this point, fast forward, to give us some context, we have seen, I'm going to modify it slightly, the country's dependence on connected critical infrastructure has grown faster than our ability to secure it. And the adversaries are here and stuff's on fire. If you zoom out for some of our mission space, and CISA needs to and is rising to meet the moment, we have had successful attacks on the water we drink, the food we put on our table, the oil and gas we use to fuel our homes and our vehicles, the timely availability of patient care during a pandemic, the schools our kids go to, the municipalities who run our cities and towns, and even federal agencies, and so on. So critical infrastructure is under attack. It is under siege, and a larger volume and variety of threat actors are becoming more brazen. There used to be topics they wouldn't touch, and now a combination of things has made everything fair game to our adversaries. So we're trying to be the most nimble and agile new federal agency and try to embrace public-private partnership, not just as a cliche, but as a verb, and I'm a living, breathing embodiment of that. We brought in several CARES Act hires from tons of disciplines. So I'm a hacker philosopher, CISO healthcare-ish type, but we brought in a physician who ran one of the largest healthcare networks in the country as a CEO of hospitals. We brought in an infectious disease expert and a presidential innovation fellow who spent time at NIH, and she helped us understand the twists and turns of the biology and virology of the pandemic. We brought in systemic risk people. We brought in data scientists. We brought in industrial controls people and pharmaceutical manufacturing expertise and supply chain people and cold chain. And
so what you're saying is security isn't just technology. Is that what you're saying?
heck
Josh?
no. Well,
I'm still laughing at the fact that Josh, for some reason I have this visual. Josh shows up and is like, I'm with the government. I'm here to help.
And no one believes that. And that's one of the reasons we're grateful.
And we're happy to see him.
Yeah. Well, it's tough for CISA to do its job effectively while people don't yet know or trust the organization. So it's opportunities like this chat that can maybe put a name and a face to what we are, what we're doing, and how we can help. So I'm sure we're going to get to some of those free services at some point. But definitely. So within that, there's a steady state enduring mission, and it's essentially we want to team up with the other parts of the federal agencies. So HHS, Health and Human Services, is what used to be called an SSA, or a sector specific agency. And as of January 1st is now changed in law to be a SRMA, a sector risk management agency. And each of these 16 critical infrastructures has one. And CISA works to complement and service each of those for that collective risk management, risk reduction mission. But during the pandemic, using these congressional hiring authorities, we hired quite a few people that can complement HHS and CDC and other parts of the federal response, including the Department of Defense and Operation Warp Speed. And we wanted to make sure that we were boundary spanners. Too many parts of government, for good and bad reasons, have a mission and a silo and a set of authorities and swim lanes. But so many of these pandemic exogenous circumstances, it was very clear from the get-go that these are multidisciplinary problems and they're going to need a multidisciplinary response. So we hope we've pulled together a pretty good team. We eventually ended up calling it the CISA COVID Task Force, and we really had two huge chunks of the mission. There's lots of ancillary things, but one was to protect healthcare delivery that was severely strained and stressed for reasons that were there before the pandemic, but the pandemic made it a lot worse. And the other half was to secure the supply chains from start to finish, to get vaccines invented and delivered into people's arms to hopefully achieve herd immunity and fight the biological threats. Under that one, we said that time was the real enemy. And what we wanted to do was avoid elective delay to that mission, because the consequences were quite severe across at least three dimensions. Number one was biological. I think at the time when we first started, a 1 month delay was potentially going to affect 5 million people. In one way, shape, or form. The numbers changed a lot over the course of the pandemic. Number two is geopolitical, and that the US standing in the world order had never been more precarious. And our performance on the world stage could either cement or compromise our position and maybe take 10, 20, 30 years to recover from, and maybe force concessions we shouldn't make in the international community. And then third was economic. The deleterious impact on US businesses, small, medium, large, employment, depression, poverty could kill more people than COVID, or at least an additional tranche of people than COVID-19 itself. So we took that mission very, very seriously and did a lot of creative and innovative things. And, just like we're new to the private sector, we were also new to our government partners. So we had to do a lot of forming, storming, norming, performing, and cross into lanes that had not previously been crossed into. And, but we did it with empathy and with mission and passion and towards affecting the public good. And
now
hopefully,
I've got to write down, farming, storming, norming, and performing.
Forming, storming, norming, performing. I learned that like right out of college. I don't remember who said it, but it's how you form a team, right? There's always some period of acclimation. And some of this is just for the exogenous pandemic work. But I think in their foresight, CISA leadership also realized that taking this opportunity to pull in folks like myself or Kendra or Bo or Kirsten and others would cross-train with CISA and show them a new op tempo. And we would learn more empathy for our government teammates when we go back to private sector, and they would learn more about how quickly we can do things when it matters. And so I think we've surprised each other. It creates heat and light. We are pushing the edges. And sometimes it's outside people's comfort zone, but I hope that we don't go back to normal after, but that we find a new normal that's somewhere in between, and we can attract and retain people like the CARES Act hires for more than just healthcare. Because as I said, we have attacks everywhere. And one of our huge epiphanies in all this work, including the vaccine work, is it's not always the big name brand people with global risk management professionals and huge security budgets. Many of the weak links in the chain, we call them ball bearings from World War II, ball bearing philosophy, but they were these small, unguarded, vital links in the supply chain that, if disrupted, could kill a whole lot of people and introduce significant delays. We found one, for example, that was critical to any DNA or mRNA vaccine trial candidates, and if disrupted, would be pretty horrible. And they had 3 IT people, 0 of them cybersecurity people, and you could sneeze on them and we'd have some pretty bad outcomes. But through this pushing and going a little further than I think we have playbooks for, we really revealed that the overwhelming majority of the risk, at least for this pandemic work, were these tiny organizations that were target rich but cyber poor. I know you like that phrase, but these are, they're valuable to somebody, so therefore they're valuable to adversaries who want to monetize it through ransomware. But they're cyber poor in that, and we define that 3 ways. You can be one or more of the following 3 deficiencies. You can be information poor, right? The deficit of, you don't know enough, or you haven't sufficiently made your stakeholders aware of the risks and the consequences. Number 2 is you could be incentives poor. Maybe there's not enough carrots and sticks to do the right thing. Maybe you know exactly what to do and you got plenty of money to do it, but no one's making you do it, so you don't, right? And if you're a delegate of critical infrastructure and you might be privately owned and operated, but you're doing national security work and critical infrastructure work, so without sufficient incentives, people may not do the right thing. But in most cases, it's number 3. It's they're actually resources poor. One of my friends and colleagues from the private sector, Wendy Nather, she has this fantastic phrase of living below the security poverty line. And sadly, most hospitals and a lot of these private owners and operators of critical infrastructure are actually resource poor. So we want to work all 3, and we're certainly taking a bite out of awareness during National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. But we started to realize just waving best practices lists at people that can't hire a single cybersecurity person may not be helpful. And one of the innovations we brought is a whole series of practical security steps. I'm sure we'll get into some of them, but that report's kind of the advanced class. And I wanted to, there's some pretty groundbreaking things in there and some data science. But I wanted to at least set the stage of the role CISA plays during the steady state mission. During the pandemic, we've intensified things quite a bit. And some of those innovations are helping us both with the target rich cyber poor community, but also specifically, we want to make sure we truly understand the risks and the manifest harm in the healthcare delivery space. So I'm happy to go anywhere you want to next, but there you go.
Well, I think, you've touched on all the things that we know. I mean, one of the reasons we started this podcast 6.5 years ago almost, is that resource poor. And to provide a resource to educate people and give them the information that they don't have time to figure out, and to explain things. So that's one of the reasons we have you here. And free. We always tell everybody our podcast is, you get what you pay for. It's free. If you're unhappy, triple your money back. So, so in a lot of ways, we enjoy joking around about that, but we show up every week because we're committed to doing this. And it's the same kind of message that you're getting out now. And it's refreshing to hear that from, a public-private partnership. Obviously, we get that part because we're part of it. But I know there's some really great math and statistics, and I get nerdy with it big time with numbers. And David's like, please don't let her do it. But I do want to make sure that we take some time and focus on those freely available resources and the value that it brings. Now, granted, we do have listeners that are outside of healthcare, and some of these aren't freely available just to anybody or individuals. But you can always ask, and they say no. They're not going to send anybody to arrest you. I don't think.
And as far as the publications, anyone can self-apply some of these guides or recommendations. It's some of the more service-shaped products that might be just for the 16 critical infrastructure sectors. But you never know, you might be in one of those right now.
Yeah. Well, most people don't get that. And particularly you're in the supply chain of your clients, because most of what we do is B2B, business, consumer related. But if you're in that supply chain, we just talked about you just mentioned the importance of securing the supply chain. Do you realize that 3 IT people were, that was news to me. There were 3 IT people that were the center of us getting a vaccine.
Well, there's so many players that go into it, right? You need to
right. But they were way down in that middle area, and I don't think people realize how important that is. And so so I know there's several resources. Let's start talking. The big list really is the Sci-Hi.
Okay.
Once you said that, I got hooked on using that. But in healthcare, using the phrase cyber hygiene really hits home better than it does in most. So let's talk about cyber hygiene services, because I tested it out, and I got 2 clients up and running on the vulnerability scanning, the external vulns. And so we know it's doable, and we're going to start spreading the word on how to do that. But there's a lot there to unpack. So you're the expert in it. You hit it for us.
Sure. I'm going to do a backing up a half step.
You do what you do, you boo.
So, and what I'll do is I'll start with the congressional task force we did a couple of years back, because that lays the ground truth for who might need our help. Yep. Then I'll show you the Sci-Hi that you're referring to as an example of a fairly large and growing list of taxpayer-funded services and documents that you can avail yourself of at CISA.gov. But some of the newer products we've put out and guidance moments, they're really trying to steer CISA and the sectors towards this practical security in light of the harsh truth that we're target rich and cyber poor. So I'll do all 3. We had a graphic in the healthcare task force report that came out, like I said, Mother's Day weekend, 2017. Right before we started was that seminal ransom attack in Hollywood, California, Hollywood Presbyterian. It was a single Java flaw in a single Java library in a single tech in a single hospital. It shut down patient care for a week. And they had to divert ambulances up the street in Los Angeles traffic. They had to cancel surgeries. They even eventually had to move critical care patients, which is not something you want to do. I mean, can you imagine being in an ambulance, bleeding or needing surgery and stuck in LA traffic? So time matters. We know minutes or hours can be the difference between walking again, talking again, breathing again. So that was pretty harrowing. And when we were first formed through that legislation, the idea was, how do we do HIPAA 2.0 in precision medicine land or in a hyper-connected telemedicine world? And because of what had just happened, and I was flying down to DC for our first meeting, it was sorry for a little bit more exposition. It's just fresh in my brain because they just ran the Boston Marathon this weekend, but it was the April Boston Marathon. And I said, everyone's got these jackets on my flight. So when I got in the room, I said, who remembers the Boston Marathon bombing? And everyone's like, oh, of course we do. I'm like, why did so few people die? They said, oh, because it was blocks away from some of the best healthcare facilities in the world. Like Boston's like teeming with some of the best institutions like this one and that one and that one. And said, plus after 9/11, we drilled and we knew in Boston, like exactly what our response should be to a physical attack. So they said, while we lost people, our response was impeccable. I said, okay, so picture a Boston Marathon bombing combined with Hollywood Presbyterian style attack for delayed integrated patient care. That's our mission. It's not HIPAA 2.0. We have to focus on patient safety and patient lives. I said, I love my privacy. I'd like to be alive to enjoy it. And we set that tone, and that's the tone we kept. So when the time came for it to end, we didn't know about WannaCry yet, but we had a graphic right in the first pages. It's a thermometer. And up top, it says healthcare industry cybersecurity is in critical condition. You're going to recognize that title in a minute, but on it had 5 uncomfortable truths of many. And I'm paraphrasing from memory, but one of them was a severe talent shortage. Our estimate, we didn't put the number in, but you could do the math with Becker's and other different things. But our estimate at the time was 85% of US hospitals lacked a single qualified cybersecurity professional on staff, not even one. And we did that because there are large, medium, small, and rural. And we tended not to find any cybersecurity teams at the medium, small, or rural. At the bigger ones, you might see 50 to 150 people, and sometimes even more. But below a certain employee count, you almost never found a cybersecurity person. You had a designated information security officer for HIPAA and high tech, but it was often the nurse who was also the accountant, who was also, the head of HR, for example. So number one, severe talent shortage. Number two, legacy technology epidemic. So we knew that it was often best case to find Windows XP in the clinical environment that year.
You still can.
You still can, and worse. And so it's incredibly difficult, even if you have the best team on earth, to defend these harder to defend unsupported end of life technologies. They're just chock full of more problems. Number three was, and this is a dig on HIPAA and high tech, but we were careful in how we worded it. We said premature and hyperconnectivity. So in the race to tie reimbursement to the ability to receive and transmit electronic health records, the meaningful use clauses, with the best of intentions, no one made brand new threat modeled secure devices. They took existing devices that were never modeled or threat modeled or intended to be connected to anything, and they forced them to connect to everything. And in that hurry, when you want something done badly, sometimes you get it done badly. And it led to a situation where we had these flat, unsegmented networks where the blast radius wasn't a single room or device or floor or wing. It was the whole hospital, maybe even your partner hospitals. So these unsegmented networks, just to allow connectivity to work, increase the blast radius significantly. And now they're exposed to the outside world as well in a lot of cases. So number four, these are patient care impact. They're not just privacy. And we initially meant Hollywood Presbyterian, but eventually we added the massive attacks on the UK government as the ink was drying on this report, affecting 40% or more of the healthcare institutions. For example, stroke centers in London were down, and you have 1 to 4 hours, 1 to 3 to 4 hours to save brain, save life when it's a stroke. Yeah, it's called the golden hour, or golden hours. And the likelihood that any citizens in London that needed stroke care that weekend got it in a timely manner is nearly zero. It's just too much of the country's capacity was down. And then lastly, if you think this is a rare occurrence that you might have a cyber attack, we saw a known vulnerabilities epidemic. So Billy Rios, a researcher, found a single medical tech that had 1,440 something known CVEs in it. And while not all of them are exploitable, it only takes one. Yeah. And quite a large number of them were exploitable. So it was not uncommon to find a typical approved medical device that had over 1,000 opportunities to hack it. To put those together, a severe talent shortage for cybersecurity in healthcare for 85%. They're trying to defend older, harder to defend things that are over-connected to each other and reachable by the outside world. A single flaw in a single device can affect patient care, and a typical device gives you 1,000 or more chances to do so. So we said this is not a good thing.
No.
So we were always prone, we were always prey. We just lacked sufficient predator interest, and that changed. That's all changed.
That was
the
changing
pandemic.
right then when you were writing the report.
Yeah.
And we see that as a turning point.
Mhm.
And we hold our HIPAA boot camps, and we will never forget that we were in the middle of teaching the section on ransomware attacks
Mhm.
when everybody started getting notices about WannaCry. It was actually happening during us teaching our concerns over ransomware attacks based on Presbyterian. So that was an absolute pivotal moment, and I had no idea just how deeply you guys had built that into what you were looking at the time. I mean, I knew it was a piece of the effort, but
Let me do a bonus
David
one.
and I were,
I'll do a bonus story, very short, just based on our previous chats. If you're familiar with the concept of SBOM, or software bill of materials, I think FDA called it CBOM initially.
Yeah.
In our task force report, we called for a software bill of materials, a list of all third-party and open source ingredients in medical technologies.
Yeah.
And the reason we did it is, and I pushed that really hard, is that Hollywood Presbyterian attack, that single Java library, there were warnings to hospitals and other sectors about the SamSam attack. And they said, if you're running this particular version of this particular library, you might be vulnerable. But the hospitals with 20,000 plus devices and very small teams, they couldn't answer two questions. Am I affected? And where am I affected?
Mm-hmm.
And I said, this is avoidable. This is preventable. If we knew what was in our software, just like we know the parts in our cars or the ingredients in our drugs and different things elsewhere, we could have had prompt and agile response. So Congress agreed with that recommendation, asked HHS to go do it. And when they did, they have in the pre-market guidance that you need a software bill of materials for all pre-market submissions. And when Commerce Department and the Chamber of Commerce, not part of the government, saw that, they freaked out and said, wait, we don't want FDA to accidentally create a de facto standard for all software. So there's been a 3+ year long initiative from NTIA, Commerce NTIA, that did multi-stakeholder design and implementation of SBOM. And some of your teammates in healthcare drove a healthcare proof of concept. People like Jennings Askey from New York Presbyterian, and some Mayo Clinic people, and a bunch of medical device makers. Well, anyhow, it was so successful that it made its way into the executive order. So I'm going to read one sentence, but it says, in the end, the trust we place in our digital infrastructure should be proportional to how trustworthy and transparent that infrastructure is, and to the consequences we will incur if that trust is misplaced. So what started with that little task force, in a lot of ways, is now proven its merit, and now it's a federal purchasing requirement being acted out by several agencies, including the one I'm currently employed by. Yeah. So that also
wait till you try to get software companies to understand that, though, which is what I'm trying to do. And when you just start asking questions, well, we don't have to tell you that. We don't have to know that.
Proprietary, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you do.
Yeah,
you do, Blanche. You do. So
sorry about that.
I have told them for years they needed to have an inventory of that so that they could deal with, if you have a CVE list, you should know where to look.
Yeah.
And you should be looking. But if that's the whole point of having an inventory of software. But if you don't have an inventory of the software in the software,
So I'll pivot from that to CISA's free services. The pivot I'll do now is the guy that ran that 3-year plus multi-stakeholder volunteer effort, Alan Friedman. He ran it for NTIA. He is now one of the newest CISA employees, and he's taken the mission in the next step where now that the federal agencies will be doing SBOM, he's going to help drive that here at CISA. So
Wow.
he graduated, and so did the topic. So we're really happy to have him too, in continuity of that, to try to drive more defensible software in the federal government.
That'd be a great idea.
So this service catalog, we have a lot of things on there, and they have strange names, and those names don't always match the nouns and verbs I used in the private sector, but it sounds like you like one of the names, at least. Cyber hygiene, called Sci-Hi for short. And it can be a little confusing on the site. Cyber hygiene is really a suite of offerings. There's two major categories. One is we'll do a free external perimeter vulnerability scan every day. You just sign up. It's basically a very short agreement that says we won't, expose your name. It can't be used against your regulatory actions. You just read through the agreement. Once you have, we sign you up. You give us some email addresses, and we'll send you a daily report of the vulnerabilities that are visible to the outside world, the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, for adversaries using traditional vulnerability scanners. There's another flavor of it that's for web application flaws. So a lot of people can't tell the difference between those two. So you probably need both. But these aren't a penetration test, as sometimes is referred to, or a bug bounty or anything like that. It's just looking for the really simple, automatable, scannable things that may lead to harm, so you can know sooner. And we also not just give you the feedback, but we study almost like public health issue. We look at different members of a sector like HPH and how that sector HPH compares to other sectors like water or manufacturing or aviation or transportation and things like that. So we kind of take an acute scan to help you find and hopefully patch or mitigate those flaws that are important. But we're also studying how responsive is the industry over time. And if there's a change, why is there a change? So this isn't telling you that you've been hacked. It's just telling you that you have the potential to be hacked. And it's free, and it's really the gateway drug for your journey into other services at CISA.
It is the gateway.
Yeah.
And that is something, you and I discussed it before. So I was like, okay, I'm trying it with two. And I had a private practice submit, and then another group we work with that is a agency within a county health system, health department. And both of them got approved, and they're being scanned, and I've seen the reports. And I mean, the good news is it's showing them nothing. And that's what they intended to see was nothing exposed, because they're very tightly locked down on the one that I've seen. I haven't seen the other one yet, but we do know how to do that, how to sign up, and we'll have all the information for you to be able to do that. You just send a few emails and sign a few forms. It's not really complicated. And that'll all be in the show notes for folks that are listening on the Help Me with HIPAA website.
That's great, especially because there's no census that I've seen lately, but we know there's about 5,600 health delivery organizations across the U.S. And we do not have 5,600 signed up for this service, and nor does the Sector Coordinating Council have direct relationships with those 5,600, nor does the ISAC, the Information Sharing Analysis group.
We like to think we do, but we don't.
Yeah. in a lot of ways, it's going to sound intuitive when I point it out, but if you have a CISO and you can have the money to pay for even the small fees to get into an ISAC, and you can at least just show up, even if it was free, you have the payroll to have qualified people come. You're already part of the haves, not the have-nots.
Yeah.
So we may be biasing some of our telemetry and ground truth towards the better funded organizations. And I sometimes call it a tale of two healthcares. And the advice we need to give is going to be different. I think the upper end wants real-time threat intelligence, machine readable threat intelligence. The bottom of the market wants help preparing for disaster recovery. And what do I do if I can't access my electronic medical records for a week or a month? So that we need fit for purpose advice that meets people where they are. And that's why, on top of things like Sci-Hi, there's a bunch of other services there people should poke around on. Some of them can be led by our regional talent. We have cybersecurity advisors called CSAs in each of your regions, and they want to meet you and they want to talk to you. And there's like a 2-hour questionnaire that can help you figure out your security posture. And there's an 8-hour version that uses the NIST cybersecurity framework to help you have a blueprint and a roadmap. And depending on those conversations, we usually try to recommend other free services like anti-phishing, practice, or there's a tabletop crisis simulation service that we do. There's a self-service one, so TTX in a box or tabletop exercise. These are kind of like the Cyberstorm one that happens less often at the national level, but much smaller scale. And it's so much better to practice in a dry run than in real life. Our kids practice fire escape drills at school. They know what to do in case of a real fire. That's where the muscle memory comes in. And we want to test assumptions in these institutions, regardless of their funding level. And a lot of even well-funded organizations had a lot of new surprises on Sci-Hi during the pandemic. Why? We had to shift to telemedicine in a hurry. We had to put up new IT in a hurry. We didn't secure it to our traditional standards. In some cases, IT staffs got furloughed or laid off for a period of time, if not permanently. So
and David went through, how many days was it straight that you were just trying to move equipment and set up equipment at people's homes and dust things off, and it literally blow the dust off of something out of a closet to set up some of these small practices.
And I don't want to send a mixed message that it's okay to live and stay below the poverty line. Like the adversaries, if you, one of the ways I put it is, if you've ever been to amusement parks, like you have to be this tall to ride the ride. When Wendy Nather first coined living below the security poverty line, it was at the same conference as I debuted a talk called H.D. Moore's Law. So very brief aside here, Moore's Law is that compute power doubles every 18 and 24 months.
Right.
I coined H.D. Moore's Law, which is H.D. Moore is the inventor of the Metasploit project, free attack tool. So I said the strength of an unskilled adversary grows at the rate of the Metasploit project. So somebody in the audience at the end of the 2 days, I was the day 1 keynote, she was the day 2 keynote. They said, so when you just convinced us that we're all living below the security poverty line, we're about this tall. And Josh just convinced us yesterday that we have to be, at this level or higher. How do we resolve the two? And it was tough because the adversaries are always getting better, but we're not always getting better. So I'm not excusing that we live below the security poverty line or that we're target rich, cyber poor. We have to do things differently. But what I am trying to engender, and some of these will feel bittersweet, is we're now on top of the traditional CISA services. We've tried to reframe some of these things in light of so many people being target rich and cyber poor. And I know some of us talked about these offline, but one of the things we published initially for healthcare was the concept, but now we're using it for all critical infrastructure sector, is bad practices. So let's not just point at good practices or best practices. I said there's some certain things that are far too common and they're dangerous. So at CISA.gov/bad practices, we have a program now it's a very small list, but it's growing. And it says things like it. You did. Thank you very much.
And we promoted it when you added the third one.
There might be a fourth one by the time people listen to this. We're having a CISA summit.
TikTok. Awesome.
TikTok. So the concept here is it's something that's been bugging me for a long time, but there's a saying that the standard you walk past is the standard you endorse. And we walk past a lot of pretty egregious things. And it's nice to talk zero trust and just do best practices and just patch. But if you are below that poverty line, if you are cyber poor, it's very dismissive and flippant. It's almost like Marie Antoinette saying, let them eat cake. There's no more bread to eat. Let them eat cake. Like no one has either one.
Right.
So we do promote and push zero trust architectures, and we help publish them. We do promote multi-factor authentication programs. We do promote best practices, and many people are miles from being able to do those. So we want to get them to the starting line, crawl, walk, run. So bad practices was the concept of, largely triggered by, if you recall, the really severe Exchange attacks earlier this year, while everyone's scurrying to patch those, and we had emergency directives from Cisa to do so for federal agencies, and we warned the private sector on these as well, given the rampant level of exploitation. A data scientist named Bob Rudis scanned the whole internet and found that the number one version by far of Exchange on the internet was unsupported. And I'm thinking, how do you have an unsupported piece of software that leads directly into Active Directory and was the keys to the kingdom? So we can talk best practices, we can do multi-factor, but if not only is the front door wide open, there's no door on the hinges, right? we have to talk about these common practices, but they are both common and dangerous. So the first one says the use of unsupported end-of-life software in service of critical infrastructure and national critical functions is dangerous. We don't pull any punches, right? And we say it materially elevates risks to national security, national economic security, and national public health and safety. This dangerous practice is especially egregious in technologies accessible from the internet. And number two is almost the same wording for default hard-coded fixed passwords. And the third one is the use of single-factor remote administration access. And we have a GitHub discussion where these are being nominated and curated for subsequent action. And the goal is not that CISA is a regulator, but we're stating the uncomfortable truths and putting a stake in the ground to say, this is dangerous and common. How do we make this practice extinct? So what can the regulators do? What can the Federal Trade Commission do? What can insurers do? Should this be uninsurable by a certain point?
Yeah. And I think eventually we're going to start seeing that with the surges that we're noting in cybersecurity coverage. And there's a lot changing in the last just 6 months on cybersecurity coverage.
Yeah, we had a client that asked us to install TeamViewer 12 on a machine the other day, and I'm like, no. Why? What are you doing? This is like super old. And they said, well, our EHR company, that's what they use to remote in to help us, and that's what they have to have. They have to have version 12.
Well, in some cases we didn't know better.
Yeah,
but we wanted to take that off the table. Now we know better.
Well, we're trying to push that message out, but we can tell you out in the wild, we're still struggling to get the message out or to get the message heard. We're giving it.
Well, some people are mad. And when I said I want to use empathy, some people don't think this is showing empathy. I think what we're doing is we're stating uncomfortable truths, and then we're following it up with the empathy. We know that some people can't just wave a magic wand and go to Office 365 or Gmail or whatever. So we know it's not trivial. We're just calling it what it is. And now we're going to convene hard multi-stakeholder conversations to say, what are the barriers to getting rid of that? Like, how do we make it? So think about it now. The majority is unsupported. What's the first plan to get it to a minority or unsupported? And then what's the plan to get it from minority to extinct? And there are ways to do it, and it might involve a whole lot of players in the ecosystem. But we're having those conversations. In fact, we talked about its National Cybersecurity Awareness Month right now, and CISA is now in the second week of its plural week CISA Summit and campaign. On week one, there's a video talking about bad practices. It has an insurer on it, a law professor, a former FTC advisor on it, and the vulnerability management team. And they're hinting at ways in which this could matriculate as a program. So bad practices. But instead of just calling things bad, which is at least a fresh angle for the people that don't have a huge team, some of these things can be fixed with no team at all. And one of the other forms of empathetic relief we provide is to get your stuff off search, is what we call it. SOS, get your stuff off search.
Off search, yes.
And this is just saying, hey, your assets are showing on the internet, see what your adversaries can see.
So many puns we're going to use with this.
I'm very literal. I don't know what you mean. When I talked to my neighbor, I said, you can use, normal web browsers to find cat pictures and documents, but you can use tools like Shodan and Census.io and Thingly to find cyber physical systems on the internet. And remote access technologies. So it's really a paint by numbers. We have a one pager that kind of shows what we mean and what the 4 steps of getting your stuff off search can look like in a pretty easy way. And then we have tool specific free guidance on how to do it. So that's not a product. Anybody can use that, whether you're in HPH, critical infrastructure, or small mom and pop business. It lets you see what adversaries can see and at least get rid of the low hanging fruit. And you don't need a deep bench and security team to do this. Just the awareness alone might be enough for you to shut something off or change a password. Or do you really need that service? Or if it is TeamViewer, can you add a gateway in front of it? If you have to use the thing,
password.
Yeah.
That's complex and only a few people know. Anything that you can add, as we always like to say, is you don't have to be faster than the bear. Just faster than the other guy running from the bear. So, and the thing I saw today, I don't know exactly when you published it, but I saw today the 4 things you can do to keep yourself cyber safe. And I know it's part of CSAM, but if everybody, my post on LinkedIn was, what if everybody did these 4 things? That's just it. We would immediately be safer.
When you look at the adversary landscape, some of them are targeted, and if they want to get you, they're going to get you. But many of them are targets of opportunity. It's wholesale, it's indiscriminate, and they land where they land, and they monetize where they're successful. Make yourself slightly less accessible. So stuff like get your stuff off search is also part of this pragmatic security playbook, right? That's forming. And again, we made these as CARES Act people for the pandemic, ground truth, but we're using them now for all of our critical infrastructure mission. And even for our, part of our design point for these bad practices is anything we state as a bad practice, we better be ready to do, federal wide. So we're going to eat our own dog food or drink our own champagne or pick your favorite metaphor, eat your own home cooking.
Yeah.
So you want to pivot to the hard stuff, the really hard stuff?
Yes.
Okay.
We hate having to talk about these things, and we have to talk about them all the time.
Right. So I know there's a little confusion because our report came out proximal to a front page story that sounds similar, and it also came out proximal to an opinion-based survey that asked hospital security executives what the impact of ransomware might be on the ability to deliver patient care. Our research is a year plus in the making and uses some hard data science. So some of the things that we studied are some hard truths. So to demystify the title of that document, remember I told you there's 16 critical infrastructure sectors that get special attention from CISA and statute. One of them is HPH, which is healthcare and public health. There's also a different way to slice and dice these, which are these 55 things called national critical functions, NCFs. There is a national critical function called provide medical care, hence the title. So provide medical care is in critical condition. And our team in the CISA Coven task force does analysis perpetually on threats to the vaccines or to healthcare delivery. And we look across the 55 national critical functions at all times to see which ones are most strained and most at risk, because risk management is about the chosen few and identifying and buying down risk. And provide medical care, I'm sure there's no surprise to you, but it's been heavily stressed throughout the pandemic, partly for those seams and cracks we talked about before the pandemic, and partly for net new reasons like PPE, supply chain shortages, or flattening the curve in hospitals early on in the pandemic, or degraded and delayed patient care, which created more complex manifestations later that needed more attention and bed space. And as the various twists and turns of the pandemic has happened, we've been tracking qualitative and quantitative impacts and risks to that function called provide medical care. So what we published on October 1st is the first 2 pages are really a preface saying why we're writing this and why now. And I'll get into the 3 reasons in a second. But what follows is a little tough to read because we took individual snippets of our analysis that we do every 2 weeks inside the federal government, and we decided to publish them in their original form. So an early, I'll get to those insights in a second. So the preamble, briefly, we're just one part of the federal government. There are other actors that should have their own voice and their own publications in their own time. But we studied a lot of these stresses and strains on provide medical care using public data from the Centers for Disease Control. Specifically, one of the ones we're going to talk about is excess deaths data, and other HHS public data sources like they have a series of time data series collection that they publish. One that we found particularly useful was ICU bed utilization. So intensive care unit bed utilization. So in the preface, we really call out three things that CISA's equities and CISA's statutory authorities care about. Number one is that given the incredibly severe strains on provide medical care, we know that as bad as it is, as measured in excess deaths from non-COVID conditions as well, heart attacks, strokes, diabetes, delayed integrated care affects mortality rates in measurable ways that the CDC defines as excess deaths. They define that as the difference between expected deaths and actual deaths for a given time period in a given state. And we have a pretty consistent model year over year that they track. So anomalies from that are called excess deaths. So we knew it was stress and strained. And I think at the time we published, there were 4 states at a state level that declared crisis standards of care, which means you save the savable and only the savable. So you're in heavy rationing. And we also had 8 that day on the cusp of crisis standards of care. So out of the 50 states, an uncomfortably high level are buckling under that pressure. So number one was to say, if provide medical care is under severe strain, cyber attacks can make it worse. So we have done hard data science to measure the impact of cyber disruption. And while we did not link any specific person to a specific loss of life from a cyber attack, what we can measure is material and significant, and we'll touch on that. Number 2 is, as provide medical care struggles and continues to struggle, its impacts are not isolated to citizens and healthcare. We are starting to see all 55 national critical functions have impact on their workforce, because as you break down the CDC data, the top demographic, and this should be shocking to your listeners, but the top demographic by age for these excess deaths were age 25 to 44-year-olds, young, prime age workers for most of our critical infrastructure sectors. And the second chunk of the most likely age demographic is also affected. So 2 of the top affected age groups are right there. So if you start to find there's not enough firemen or manufacturing or transportation truck drivers or longshoremen to unload these supply gluts that we're having in San Francisco ports or LA ports, there's a cascading effect. So if number 1 is that we're having a loss of life and cyber attack can make it worse, number 2 is every single one of the critical infrastructure sectors and all the employers and owners and operators, you stand to be at the highest risk of losing your strategic workforce, either to sickness and death or as they care for members of their family who have encountered sickness and death. But B, you also have the opportunity to help provide much needed relief on hospitals and these ICU bed strains by taking non-medical interventions, by pushing masking or testing, by encouraging and maybe even mandating vaccinations, because the lives you save may be your own employees and may preserve our country's ability to function. And then number 3, we're targeting our state and local tribal territorial leaders, our SLCT, through CISA's responsibilities for state, for the multi-state ISAC and the state and local leaders to enable decision support so they can take their own measures to track, measure, and buy down risk. So popping again, I said a lot of stuff in there. We know there's severe loss of life through excess deaths based on strains on provide medical care, and specifically can measure how cyber attacks can make it worse. Number 2, because of those losses of life affecting our prime workers, we really need to make sure all stakeholders are doing their part to track these risks and to mitigate these risks. And then lastly, the state and local leaders can do something about it. So that's the first 2 pages, and there's a lot in there, and some of it's pretty heavy, but we continue to say no one's ever died from cyber attacks, and the math just suggests that that's not true anymore.
Right. Well, then we just had a lawsuit filed in Alabama, the death of a child due to a ransomware attack. So that is that's new news, but certainly not anything we haven't talked about many times. We even talked about the situation in Germany that happened last year, that a ransomware attack, they turned an ambulance away. So the numbers, I mean, I know that multiple times David's mentioned it's just a matter of time before we have that evidence that would show a cyber attack directly impacting patient care.
So you have a smart and savvy audience, so I'll stick to our report and what we did study. So to explain this, because it's a little confusing, I'm going to use my left hand and my right hand. I'm part Italian. I got to speak with my hands. So one thing we noticed before I get to the data science part, one of the first things you'll find in that report is a little graphic that shows when we had staffing shortages or PPE shortages, staff got sick, which made the staff shortage compression, which made for worsened patient care, which made for more burned out and stressed people. So we had this vicious cycle between supplies, staffing, and sickness. But the next one's pretty fascinating. It starts off with these green squares and circles, and then goes to yellowish and then orangish and reddish. In healthcare delivery, there's canonical defined terms of conventional care, contingency care, and crisis care. And during peacetime, if a hospital has a power outage or an active shooter situation or a ransom attack, the general plan is we will divert ambulances to next nearest facilities. And there's enough slack in the system that hospitals can absorb it. But the pandemic strained everybody. There's no room at the inn. There's no slack in the system. And what we found initially at the city or county level is a single failure tended to cascade into regional failures quite quickly. Zoom out now to when we published this on October 1st, we're now seeing that same exact model manifest at the state level. So Idaho defined crisis standards of care, and every state adjacent to it is also now on the cusp of crisis standards of care. So you're not getting diverted to the next nearest hospital, you're getting diverted to the next nearest state. In fact, Texas was shipping people by train and plane several states away for some of their procedures. So we're in a bad way. Here's where the data science comes in. We looked at CDC excess deaths. We wanted to find a measurement in my left hand for how do we measure strain, because there's 5,600 hospitals across the US. Cisa and HHS cannot go work with every single one of them equally. They're not equal risk. And when we have a spate of ransom attacks or other things, how do we do risk prioritization? So we looked at CDC excess death data for the period of the pandemic. And you might recall that somber day and headline that the US hit 500,000 dead Americans from COVID. Around the same time, we hit over 150,000 additional excess deaths from non-COVID conditions, things like heart attacks, strokes, pulmonary issues, diabetes. And that's where that demographic came in, about 25 to 44-year-olds amongst the largest group. So we said, how do we measure this? We have data scientists, let's do math. And we tried a number of variables, but we found that if you correlate CDC excess deaths across the nationwide numbers and the statewide numbers across the entire 12, 13 months of the pandemic by then, if you correlate it with ICU bed utilization, we had strong positive correlation that if you achieve a certain ICU utilization, you will see excess deaths 2, 4, and 6 weeks later in a predictable way. The higher above this threshold you got, the more excess deaths you would see. So in that particular document that we published, I'm doing this one from memory because we had 2 different time slices, but I believe if you hit 75% bed utilization nationwide, you would see 12,000 excess deaths 2 weeks later, and then some more 4 and 6. If you hit 100% bed utilization, you would see, I believe it was 80,000 excess deaths 2 weeks later, more 4 and more at 6. And these are huge numbers, huge. And the nation hit some of those danger zones as a nation 3 times throughout 2020 and early 2021. In the course of us publishing this, we now hit a 4th major peak over the August, summer peaks of hospitalization that we are now publishing through. And we haven't even hit the winter peak, which was the largest last year. So August already exceeded the winter peak from last year. So that's not a good omen for where we're headed if we don't do something different. So in the left hand, we have a strong, statistically significant correlation with the regression and all the data science stuff you want to talk about. But to publish in a peer-reviewed academic journal, you need a p-value of 0.05, and we are well higher than that in our quality. So we're actually going to publish a piece of that with the Centers for Disease Control jointly shortly. They're not going to look at everything we write, but that particular piece, because it's a stunning leading indicator. And it's also an intuitive, because as much time as you two spend in healthcare, it is often a target optimization to hit 75%. But what we're saying is once you're at 75% or higher, you're in the red zone. And it's partly because of the additional context of the pandemic and the additional care and reduced access to the tools and technologies we need. So if that's in your left hand, what about cyber? So we now know how to measure hospital strain in ways that strongly correlate to measurable excess deaths at the national and state level. We looked at some natural experiments in victims of cyber attacks with protracted effects. And within the same place, in the same time period, we controlled for their peer group of size of hospital, type of hospital, in the same place at the same time with the same conditions, and controlling for those variables across a statistically significant amount of time. We looked at people who were attacked against their peers who were not attacked. And what we found was that hospitals attacked achieved these dangerous stress zones sooner and or stayed there longer. So while we can't measure, did a cyber attack kill this person or that person or how many people, what we can measure during the time of the pandemic is the danger zones in which we start to accelerate excess loss of life. And we see that cyber can cause that. So backing up, we can measure hospital strain, and we can measure that cyber attack makes it worse sooner. So we're kind of past the point of saying, can cyber disruption affect human life? And to the point where we have to start asking, what do we do about it? So at least for now, even though we're strained and stressed, CIS is renewing its push to engage the IT teams and the leadership teams in these hospitals to help make sure preventable disruptions are prevented between now and the end of the pandemic. But there's also going to be significant after action and maybe even stimulus and policy discussions about which hospitals need more resilience and which systems are too important to fail, and which degradation can lead to more loss of life sooner. So there's a huge chunk in the back that tries to measure the impact by watching these natural experiments during the pandemic. And we learned a lot by just doing head-to-head comparisons. There's one more subtle thing in there. I know we said a lot and it's how heavy, but while most of that data science will go away when the pandemic does, a lot of these are just artifacts and features of the excess patient loads. Mm-hmm. Some won't. By revealing the system dynamic better, there's a graphic towards the end that shows 1, 2, 3, 4 steps with some concentric rings. And in that graphic, it shows a hospital in diversion mode, so sending patients to another facility. And there's a 4.4 minute circle there and a couple others. That 4.4 is not arbitrary. There was a New England Journal of Medicine article about the effects of US marathons on mortality rates for heart conditions. And in that, they found across 4 different cities, across plural years of study, that if you have a heart attack in a city that has a marathon going on, you are statistically significantly more likely to incur mortality within 30 days. And the reason was a 4.4 minute longer ambulance ride translated into that increased mortality rate. Wow. So if 4.4 minutes can affect life and death for a heart attack, and 4 hours can affect life and death for a stroke, what can the impact of 4 weeks or more be for many US healthcare institutions? So we know degraded and delayed patient care, irrespective of cause, can affect patient outcomes. And now we're seeing very pronounced and protracted impact from cyber disruption. So back to that little circle, even during peacetime, when the water lines recede from pandemic, we know now that if you have a disruption, if you don't have next proximal alternative care, within driving distance of those thresholds for heart attacks, strokes, and some of these other time-sensitive pulmonary conditions, then this becomes an opportunity to say these systems either need to be hardened and more resilient against attack in these rural areas, or we need to build more available alternative care in the region. Because if in the right of boom sense for CISA in a couple of years from now, if we have a ransom attack in New York City or a ransom attack in the middle of a urban or rural area, we know the impact may be more severe with the one that has no proximal alternative care. So we're working on some tactical uses of this data in this report and some strategic uses with CDC and with HHS and with Congress to talk through how do we make sure healthcare delivery is more resilient against adversary activity in cyberspace. So there's a lot in there.
Yes. And it is absolutely one of those things that now I see why you brought this up. When we just sat through the 405D Spotlight webinar that was for CSAM last week. And you mentioned this report because it tied so well. And we're going to have links to that webinar. It was a very good webinar, and the information shared by the Vermont University Medical Center. They were under attack. They had a ransomware attack this time last year, and they were very transparent in explaining how that did impact patient care and patient safety. And the value I got from that, just in what I can advise our clients on how to deal with these things, was immense. And so now I totally get why you brought up everybody should check out this new report, because it ties in perfectly with that discussion that was across the board. Very, very valuable. So I highly recommend folks check it out, and you'll hear Josh mention it again.
Yeah, at least for my part of that webinar, we got to team up with the FBI, my FBI colleague and my HHS colleague, to say, what do we do in the future if people want to prevent themselves from being a victim of a cyber attack? And how do you best work with the various superheroes in the Avengers here? And that no matter who you call, you hopefully will get a prompt and agile assist from all the relevant players in the right time.
Call to one is a call to all. And then you see Josh with his Captain America shield and his Thor hammer standing there with the wind. Well, your hair won't be blowing in the wind, but
no, I was gonna try to move that hammer, but I didn't feel very worthy today. I couldn't lift it.
I want to see his Spider-Man tights.
You can't see it, but I have a life-size Tobey Maguire Spider-Man in my foyer, and every time it's Halloween, someone's like, "Oh, did you put him out for Halloween?" I said, "Nope, he's there every day."
Nope, he was there every other Wednesday. So, but I know that we've used up a ton of your time, and we've got a great deal of things that we could keep going on. I do want to make sure that we touch on just due to ransomware, and we've talked about ransomware. The impact, the number one cyber attack that really brings folks down to their knees is ransomware. And this time last year, CISA, FBI, everybody released the thing, healthcare's under attack. There's news coming out that another research firm, not CISA, not blaming you, but Mandiant, says they are noticing the Fin12 ransomware group like aggressively targeting healthcare. We know it's there, and we don't want to leave out the resources that you're trying to make available to help us prepare for and prevent ransomware. So hit on that real quick before we close out.
So sadly, ransomware was ignored by most parties in cybersecurity for too long. It just wasn't interesting enough. And it's not itself a thing, right? It's the punchline of a bunch of prior lapses or failures, right? Anyone can be the victim of a cyber attack, and specifically ransomware is really the final payload. of other failures upstream. But I think it flourished and grew in the neglect from the collective community. But this has become very important to the whole of the federal government. It's been important to CISA. It's been important to the parent DHS. The White House has really leaned in hard on this. And one of the ways we've collectively responded is we now have a single one-stop shop for ransomware information for the whole of the federal government. So you don't get competing information or partial information. And it's at stopransomware.gov. There's a couple different ways to get to it, but this incorporates some of the best information from FBI, Secret Service, HHS, the different sector risk management agencies, ourselves, to try to make this clearer. And there's different ways to interact with it, but essentially the three big chunks are, I want to learn more about ransomware. A second chunk is, and this isn't the right order, but another chunk is, I've been the victim of ransomware. What do I do? Another chunk is, I don't want to be the victim of ransomware. What do I do? So a lot of kind of general information, left of boom, right of boom. And as we fill in more holes and introduce new products like CISA bad practices or stuff off search, these have been added in a single place. We're also heavily pushing and punctuating more actionable advice, irrespective of your resource levels, through CISA Summit, which is each week of National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. We're currently in week 2. And those are archived public talks with world-class speakers from inside and outside of government on the topics we care about here. And that includes a lot of the findings from that huge ransomware task force that happened recently outside of government with some government participation. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe this is a good catalytic moment to talk to your stakeholders, your executive stakeholders, because this is long looked at as a IT issue or a cybersecurity issue. And while these attacks start in IT, they very quickly become business level issues and business level impact. And there's a bunch of things you can find there, but one that may not be as easy to find is the White House had put out a memo saying, hey, we had this executive order for the federal agencies, but you as executive leaders in the private sector, the owners and operators of critical infrastructure, you have a job to play too. So we did a webinar at CISA to try to explain what that executive order memo to the private sector entailed and how to get started somewhere, get started anywhere. The one I like to call it the most, though, is without executive buy-in, participation, and real internalization and awareness, this will often be a marginalized project that gets cut when it matters. So we encourage that your tabletop exercises, your crisis simulations include your executive stakeholders. You know, who do you call first? Which agency? Are you involving your legal counsel? Do you have paper printouts in case you can't access your incident response plan? You know, just things like practicing failure such that you fail more gracefully when it matters. Do you even have your posture and decision on if you're going to try to pay or if your insurance companies want to pay? And of course, in the federal government, we discourage payment as a perverse incentive to fuel your adversaries to come back at you harder. So we know there's hard decisions to be made and people continue to make them, but we're trying to raise the threat IQ, the general awareness through stopransomware.gov, our CISA Summit, all the different campaigns this month and beyond. But one of those really gripping areas, and you might need to pluck certain graphs and data science out of it, but one way to get attention of stakeholders is this is now a patient care, patient safety, patient life issue. And much like the quality transformation, or even Semmelweis getting us to wash our hands before surgery, we now stand at the cusp of really understanding the next wave of how to reduce loss of life and provide better patient care in the future.
Well, what is it we say around here, David? What is that tagline we've said for all those years?
I can't think of it.
What is it?
It's not compliance. It's about patient care.
Yep. That's the way we've always tried to approach it. So yes, HIPAA, your privacy is there, but HIPAA security, we try to bring across the point that if you're worried about HIPAA compliance for your security program, you're in the wrong box. That was what you did 15 years ago. That is not what you do today. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, you may have even gotten away with it 10 years ago, but we definitely do not live in that world anymore. And I think CISA is evidence of the importance of us looking at defending ourselves. I remember years ago at a cybersecurity here in Atlanta, a seminar, and feeling a shadow come over me as I'm making coffee, and it's a dude and a military guy speaking about what the Army was starting to do to build better cyber defenses. And first of all, the shadow got my attention because I hadn't had coffee yet. So that was scary. And then, I mean, these are serious folks that were converting out of leadership for military attacks. Well, I'm talking about how old I am. So, but at any rate, what you are doing under DHS and what you're doing with CISA, it is reiterating over and over and over the message that cybersecurity is no longer an IT issue. It is no longer something that is, the folks in the basement with the big computer. It is everybody's responsibility. That's one of the messages of CSAM and Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And it's definitely one of the messages that we try to get across here in our podcast every single week is everybody's got to participate. But now I hope you all know that we aren't lying. There are free things that you can get to help. And all of that's going to be available. And as we bring more things in, hopefully we can get Josh to come back and tell us about no cool things in the future. I know it, once you're outside of your government gig, it could be a different conversation. But we really appreciate your time being with us, because these are all super important. And I know David was well behaved today, and all of our listeners will let you know that.
Yeah.
There's I recently was reminded of some things we said in year one of the cavalry, and things we said on in that task force report. But one of the things that got me in trouble when we wrote that congressional task force report is I had a slide that said we kept hearing from these hospitals that they can't afford security. They can't afford it. They can't afford it. So I made a slide emotionally that just said, if you can't afford to protect it, then you can't afford to connect it. And it was very polarizing because some people thought it was spot on. Other people hated it. So I've softened it since then, and channeling my inner Stan Lee here. I'll pivot to, with great connectivity comes great responsibility.
There you go. I like it.
But if the cavalry isn't coming, what we told the hackers when we founded it, and now what I'm telling each of your listeners is, as the world and as modern healthcare increasingly depend upon connected technology, they increasingly depend upon you. Mm-hmm. We got a job to do. It's time to rise to meet the moment. Yeah.
See, there he is. He is channeling Stan Lee.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly, every comic book comes alive with a cyber defender. Josh, you've been great, and you're such a wealth of knowledge. And you reiterate the fact that calling someone a hacker does not mean they're a criminal.
Hacking is magic.
Yes.
Thank goodness we had Gandalf and Harry Potter and Hermione to save us from the bad wizards, right? Hacking is magic. We use our hacking for good.
That's right. So all hackers are not bad hackers. So that's not the same. There are criminals who use cyber crime skills to their skills for evil. But definitely, David, anything you want to add before we close it off? Or normally we're like, if you want to reach Josh, but I don't know that you publish all of that stuff. I know that's challenging, but anything you want to add, let us know. Otherwise, David, he'll do his thing because he's good at that.
Yeah. No, I had to be good today. I'm on enough government lists. I don't need to be on this one.
And we won't get into it today, but if you want to, depending on your role, there's new and growing ways to participate. Director Easterly, during her Black Hat keynote, unveiled the JCDC, which is a way that other private sector firms can be part of this public-private partnership as a verb, collaborate in a real sense. So different stakeholders can play different places. We need heroes, we need sidekicks, we need supporters, we need everybody. This is going to take a whole of government and a whole of critical infrastructure response. It's pretty dark out, but it's darkest before the dawn. And if people step up and if people get activated and if we confront some of these hard truths, we can see our way through it.
Mm-hmm. We concur. And you'll give us the information on how to contact to participate, or how to learn more about participating. We have a lot of the stuff, but we don't have the newer thing there.
Yep.
So definitely let us have that. We'll put it out there.
Next month there'll be more. The month after that, continuous improvement.
We pay attention, Josh. We do.
Yeah.
Well, I do. And then David listens to what I tell him to pay attention to.
All right, folks, that's our show for today. Thanks for listening. For Donna and Josh and myself, HIPAA is not about compliance. It's about patient care.